In a 2004 Guardian article, the Danish-British comedian and author Sandy Toksvig wrote, "Years ago when I was studying anthropology at university, one of my female professors held up a photograph of an antler bone with 28 markings on it. This," she said, "is alleged to be man's first attempt at a calendar. We all looked at the bone in admiration. Tell me," she continued, "what man needs to know when 28 days have passed? I suspect that this was woman's first attempt at a calendar." Now, when this quote started making rounds again on social media more recently, it got us thinking. People have been shedding their uterine lining for millennia, but what archaeological evidence do we have of periods and menstruation? Spoiler alert, we don't have much, but not for reasons you might think. Hi, I'm Dr. Smiti Nathan, and I'm an archaeologist. In this video, we're going to explore the archaeology of menstruation and why this area has been hidden for so long. Now let's get into it. The study of menstruation has been understudied in archaeology. Why? Well, there are two primary reasons. The first is patriarchy. While not all women and only women menstruate, women are the largest group that have periods, and they're a group that was overlooked in early archaeological research. Think about the idea of man's first attempt of a calendar from earlier. The second reason is a bit more complex and expands on the first, and that's colonialism. We know that people across time and across the world have different traditions and material cultures related to periods. However, many archaeologists have interpreted ethnographic, historical, and archaeological data from a perspective that is strongly influenced by colonial views of menstruation, which often meant narrowing our view of the wide range and rationales of these traditions. In the last decades, we've made a lot of progress in considering gender, identity, and decolonization when we're analyzing the archaeological record. But when it comes to menstruation, there's still a significant gap. So when looking at the archaeological record for evidence of menstruation, let's focus on three areas for this video: products, places, and practices. Let's start with period products. Typically, the first thing that comes to mind with period products are items used to capture menstrual fluids. Now, it should be noted that in certain past societies, there might not have been a desire for products that capture menstrual fluid. Some scholars studying various time periods and regions have suggested that people might have just bled into their clothes. Anyway, when we first started researching ancient products that might have been used to capture menstrual fluid, we were really excited. Initially, we found a lot of mentions of diverse products across time and places. However, when we dug a bit deeper, we came up a bit short in finding credible primary sources, or the interpretations seemed to be off. For example, numerous websites and articles mention that ancient Greeks used wool tampons. This seems to come from people thinking that the Greek physician Hippocrates described the practice of wrapping some lint or wool around a piece of wood, and that was used as a tampon. However, that's not really true. On her blog, Mistaking Histories, Helen King, a retired classics professor who wrote her dissertation on ancient menstruation, dives into the Greek wool tampon debate. I highly recommend checking out her full blog post, and I'll offer some highlights here. First off, there wasn't an ancient Greek word for tampon. Tampons, as we know it, are a modern invention dating to the 1930s. That's not to say that there couldn't have been tampon-like products in the past. In fact, there are numerous ancient and historical documents from cultures all across the world that detail inserting various items into the vagina for various purposes. However, when it comes to ancient Greece, King thinks the word modos may have been the root of the wool tampon confusion. Modos is mentioned in the Hippocratic treatise Joints and Instruments of Reduction, in the section telling a physician to roll up lint in a rag or soft thin leather and insert it into a fractured nose. According to one of the most popular ancient Greek dictionaries, translations of modos include tent, tampon, and lint pledgelet for dressing wounds. When it comes to menstruation, modos is mentioned in the Hippocratic text Diseases of Women, and a different translation of the word in this context calls it a pessary, which is a removable treatment that is inserted into the vagina. According to this Hippocratic text, these pessaries were often wrapped in wool before insertion, but they were not used for capturing menstrual fluid during a typical period. So King thinks the translation of the word modos might be where the idea and confusion of Greek wool tampons came from. From my own experience learning languages, I know there are ideas and concepts that don't translate one-to-one, and we do our best to make sense of them. However, it's important to recognize when we might be imposing our modern worldviews and experiences on the past. Revisiting ancient sources and translations of popular ideas surrounding possible ancient period products gets us one step closer to a better understanding of the archaeology of menstruation in general. And while ancient documents and their translations are immensely helpful, in the Americas, we've actually relied on another sort of data set to help us better interpret the archaeological record when it comes to menstruation. This leads us to the second thing we look for when we're trying to identify menstruation in the archaeological record: places. In the Americas, our understanding and interpretation of spaces related to menstruation heavily come from ethnographic accounts of multiple indigenous communities. Now, it's important to know two things when it comes to these accounts. First off, ethnographic observations of what current or near past indigenous communities are doing aren't a one-to-one analogy of what happened in the past. Second, some of these ethnographic observations, especially early ones, try to impose colonial beliefs about menstruation on indigenous communities. In recent years, more work has been done to critically interrogate and decolonize our understandings of the past based on these observations, but more on that later. When it comes to menstruation, there are numerous ethnographic accounts from multiple indigenous communities on spaces that facilitated the spatial separation of people who were menstruating. In the past, archaeologists referred to these places as menstrual huts. However, that's definitely a misnomer, as these spaces and how they're composed and situated vary across time and across the world. One of the most famous early archaeological examples of menstrual spaces is at the Newt Cache shelter in eastern Kentucky. Archaeologists found a cache of nuts, seeds, spoons made of shells, fibers, bedding, and medicinal plants that date to about 4,000 years ago. The archaeologists suggest that this rock shelter may have been a sanctuary and retreat for people who were menstruating or had recently given birth, given the presence of the medicinal herbs, soft fibers that were likely used for padding, and shell artifacts which were associated with fertility. But what happens when you don't have any artifacts? Let's go to the interior of the Pacific Northwest to the Flying Goose site located on the ancestral lands of the Kalispel tribe of Indians in northeastern Washington state. Archaeologists found a burned structure when they were excavating the site, and the nature of the structure was curious. You see, the size, where it was located, and the lack of artifacts didn't match up to known archaeological architectural types for the region. The researchers decided to delve a bit deeper and conduct an array of scientific analyses, and they ended up finding some interesting things. Thousands of years ago, the space for this structure was dug out, used in a way that didn't leave behind artifacts, and then intentionally burned at a low temperature and then buried. At least one spring flood passed at the site before people returned to set another intentional fire with possible symbolic plant offerings. Based on the archaeological, scientific, and ethnographic data, the researchers believe that this structure was a menstrual lodge. The ancestral Kalispel, as well as many other indigenous communities in North and South America, felt that people held great power while they were menstruating, especially during one's first cycle. Sometimes people were only separated into other spaces during their first menstrual cycle, and sometimes these spaces were burned after they were used. As Patricia Galloway argued in her seminal article, "Where Have All the Menstrual Huts Gone?", menstrual structures likely had distinct features that would help us locate them in the archaeological record. While Flying Goose didn't have visible artifacts that could be associated with menstruation like at Newt Cache, researchers did leverage various data sets and dove a bit deeper to help reveal this possible menstrual lodge. Now, so far we've talked about products and places as it relates to menstruation. So that brings us to our third area that we could examine in the archaeological record, and that's practices. Specific practices surrounding menstruation often reflect certain underlying beliefs. The same practice or a similar practice could have very different implications depending on the underlying beliefs surrounding menstruation. For example, let's take the practice of spatially separating folks who are menstruating. This is a practice that's actually observed in many communities around the world. For the Kalispel, people were separated while menstruating due to beliefs surrounding their great power. However, in Nepal and some Hindu communities, separation occurs because menstruating folks are believed to be unclean. These chowsheds, which are used for menstrual separation, are actually illegal in Nepal. Why? Well, because the conditions of these structures have resulted in increased susceptibility to freezing temperatures, snake bites, physical assault, and even death. However, chowshuts are only one component of chowpathy, which are specific practices and beliefs surrounding menstruation and childbirth in Nepal, with uncleanliness as a common theme. So while chowshuts and menstrual lodges both facilitate spatial separation, they each come from different underlying beliefs which have different implications for menstruating folks. Now, negative underlying beliefs surrounding menstruation has been present in certain societies across time and around the world. In the Middle Ages in Europe, medicine was based on humoral theory, which hypothesized that ailments were caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. Based on this idea, physicians thought that people who menstruated had an excess of blood, which meant that anyone with a uterus was basically diseased. These beliefs not only influenced people in Europe, but people who would go on to colonize many other parts of the world. For example, in the Americas, certain early ethnographic accounts of indigenous menstrual practices are rooted in these colonial sentiments towards menstruation. As indigenous scholar Kucha Baldi puts it, the Western menstrual taboo not only influences theories of indigenous menstrual customs, but also relies on settler colonial rhetoric to help support a continuing politics of taboo. Unfortunately, stigmas have resulted in practices that socially, mentally, and physically mistreat those who menstruate, both in the past and present. Stigmas also contribute to why there isn't as much scholarly research done on menstruation. Biological anthropologist Kate Clancy mentioned the disgust she encountered when she told people she was writing a book about periods. Such stigmas have likely influenced the lack of scholarly interest on this subject, as well as obscured our interpretation of the archaeological record. For example, the ancient Egyptian text Satire of the Trades, which dates to around 1950 to 1900 BCE, remarks that a washerman's duties are undesirable and lists one of the tasks as cleaning the cloth of a person who menstruated. Some scholars thought this indicated an Egyptian taboo towards menstruation. However, other scholars didn't think that was the case. You see, the Satire of Trades describes a father trying to convince his son to be a scribe by making more manual professions out to be undesirable. While the reference to a menstrual cloth is certainly not positive, it's not indicative of a strong taboo towards menstruating folks. Instead, it more likely indicates biases surrounding gender and laundry tasks, as well as a possible dislike for menstrual blood. As Terry Wolfong puts it, the tendency to see a formal menstrual taboo reflected in ambiguous evidence is not exclusive to Egypt, but is frequently found in studies of pre-modern cultures. So when it comes to uncovering the archaeology of menstruation, we need to interrogate our own beliefs and stigmas regarding menstruation as we interpret past practices. Many people have experienced menstruation across time and across the world. It's an important part of our human history and many people's present reality. While this subject has been understudied and therefore hidden archaeologically, the good news is that there's been more work done on this subject in recent years. Some of this work isn't even about finding new sites and new artifacts. It's about re-looking at what we've already found. I'll have links to all the studies we've mentioned, as well as some other studies that we didn't have time to mention in the blog post in the description. Now, we mentioned a lot of methods that archaeologists can use to understand the past, so if you're interested in learning a bit more about some other methods, check out this playlist here. That's all for this video, and we'll catch you in the next one. Bye.